Welcome to the Deep Blue on My Doorstep podcast. I'm Tracy Ainsworth from the University of New South Wales. In this podcast series, we will talk to marine experts about the marine environments that we have right on our doorsteps and what we can do to help conserve and protect these blue spaces. Professor Kylie Pitt, welcome to Deep Blue on My Doorstep podcast. Kylie is Professor and Head of Marine Science Program at Griffith University. She leads the Sea Jellies Laboratory at Griffith Uni, which is also based at SeaWorld. This is one of the only laboratories of its kind in the world. Not only does the research that Kylie lead aim to better understand sea jellies and jellyfish, but people can actually visit this lab at SeaWorld, see many of the different kinds of sea jellies, and actually watch the research as it's happening in the lab. Hello, Kylie, and thank you so much for joining us today to enlighten us about the mysterious world of jellies.
Hi, Tracy. No, it's great to be part of this, so thanks for the invitation.
That's great. For me, the most lovable jelly is the upside-down one, Cassiopeia. I think once we've seen a jellyfish happily living upside down and wiggling away, it's impossible not to think they're amazing. Do you have one all-time favourite jelly?
Oh, it's so hard. They're all different. I love Cassiopeia for a couple of reasons. One is that it's so easy to keep in the laboratory. So because it sits upside down, it really is pretending that's a sea anemone rather than a jellyfish. So that means that it's been one of the few species that we were able to keep and experiment on before we got our new laboratory. So, and the other really neat thing about it is that it's full of zooxanthellae. So like corals that have symbiotic algae that live in their tissues, that the upside-down jellyfish is the same. And so it's becoming a really good model for trying to understand symbiosis. And because it doesn't have the calcification that corals have, it means that we can actually ask questions without the complication that calcification can actually provide. So Cassiopeia is great. I've got a soft spot for the blue blubber that a lot of people along the East Coast might be familiar with. I've got a soft spot for it because it's the species that I studied for my PhD and I've been studying ever since, I guess. So that's a favourite. And then, I don't know, there's a whole heap of them out there. They're just beautiful. Like some of them are just so spectacular. The crown jelly, for example, is probably the most gorgeous animal I think I've ever seen. Someone once described them as being like a floating merry-go-round, and I think that's a fantastic way of describing jellies.
Oh, that's awesome. For a lot of people, when we talk about jellies, we think they're mesmerising to look at, beautiful to watch swim, but really painful to get too close to, which can make them a bit more difficult to love. But you've just, described some amazing jellies. They're much more than beautiful and painful. They're actually a really important part of our oceans and marine ecosystems. What do you think is kind of the main finding in some of your research that people can think about to get a better appreciation for how important jellies are?
Yeah, so I mean, people do tend to have a bit of a dim view of jellies, and that's because their interactions with them are usually being stung when they're at the beach or out surfing or something, and of course some of them are quite dangerous. But if you can view jellies behind glass, they're really amazing. And I mean, jellies have been swimming in the ocean for more than 500 million years. They're one of the oldest animal forms on the planet. And our oceans would be a very different place if we didn't have jellies in them. So they offer some really important ecosystem services. So if you've ever been swimming with jellies and watching them sort of from a safe distance when you've been snorkeling, you might see that there's a whole lot of different animals that associate with the jellies. So you might see fish, and in particular little larval fish swimming around the jellies. You might see crabs that are climbing up around their bell. You might see even some barnacles attached to the jellyfish. And so the jellyfish are really important in sustaining biodiversity in the ocean because they provide habitat for a whole suite of different animals. And some of the fish that associate with the jellies are actually commercially important. So in a way, the jellies are helping us sustain a food source that we use. And without the jellies, these animals that associate with them may not be able to flourish like they do.
Are there particular risk factors that we need to manage for to make sure that really important functional role that jellies play in the ocean continues unabated? I mean, they've made it this far. Is there anything we have to really be paying attention to make sure they keep going?
I think so. And one of the big concerns I have, and one of the things I've been doing as a researcher in this field, is trying to stress that not all jellies are the same. So even when you go to a jellyfish conference, people talk about jellies in a general term, and they make sweeping generalizations about these animals. So there are many parts of the world where populations of jellies have increased and become nuisances for people. But it's not every jelly. In fact, it's a really small subset of jellyfish that are doing this. So I think, jellies are no different to, say, mammals, in that you've got some mammals that are like rats and rabbits. They're invasive, they're problematic. But then you've got some that are, like bilbies that are really precious and that we need to actually conserve. Jellies are the same. There are some really problematic species, but there will be some species that are probably really suffering under the changes to the ocean that we're making. The problem with jellies is that it's really hard to study them. So everybody studies the ones that are easy to keep in the lab and that are really abundant because we can do so. It's just for logistical reasons. So I think that's really skewed our understanding of the ecology of these organisms because we're just focusing on the problematic species. We don't know whether we're losing biodiversity. I suspect we are probably losing biodiversity in the oceans, but we don't know because, we'll be losing the species that are rarer and a lot more difficult to study. So a lot of people sort of laugh when I talk about conservation of jellyfish. But yeah, it's just, look, I always find it amazing the change in mindset. People talk about corals. We understand that corals are precious. They need to be conserved. Talk about jellyfish. People just think they're a nuisance and we need to wipe them off the planet. And we really need to change that way of thinking. And we need to change it among, my colleagues, the researchers in the field, and we need to convey that message to the public.
Nice. That's really interesting because a lot of people probably do think that we're worried that jellies are going to be a huge problem in the future, that they're going to bloom and take over the places we love and we're not going to be able to access them as much. And what you're saying is your research is really showing that those kind of assumptions aren't real, and that there's so much more to them than that worry, and they can actually be impacted.
Yeah, I think so. Certainly there are the robust species, but yeah, I think there are a lot of species that are a lot more vulnerable than what we give them credit for. And I guess this idea of jellies taking over the ocean is something that has really come about in the last 20 years or so. And probably the most exciting research that I've ever done was looking at that and trying to test that hypothesis. And we did that through a team of international researchers. And what we did was pull together all long-term data sets on jellyfish that we could get from around the world. And we ended up with about 38 data sets that were longer than 10 years in duration. And when we put all of those data sets together, we were just absolutely astounded because what happened is that you could see this really clear trend of jellyfish populations going up and down on about a 20-year cycle. And so when people have been concerned about jellyfish populations increasing around the world, when that first really started to, I guess, people started to talk about that as being a problem was in the late 1990s. But when you look at the data set, you can actually see that was a rising phase of this jellyfish cycle. And then in the early 2000s, we're on a decreasing phase, and we're now in an increasing phase again, we think.
That's super interesting because we, think jellyfish, they're probably short-lived. Maybe these phases are annual, 1 year to 1 year might be bigger than the other, but that's 20-year cycle is massive. Any idea why there's this?
We do have some ideas. They're not yet published, so this is very much a hypothesis. But there's a very strong correlation, and I emphasise that it's correlation, between the oscillations in the jellyfish populations and sunspot activity. So every 11 years, you have these sunspot cycles, and every 11 years you come to an end of the sunspot cycle. And at that point, the polarity of the sun switches. And so you end up with this 22-year cycle, and it matches up almost perfectly with the jellies. And in fact, there's lots of populations of different types of organisms, from larval fish to seagrass, that seem to go through these 22-year oscillations. And it may well be due to some large effect that this solar cycle has on the world's weather patterns. So we think it might change the zonal wind. That might affect upwelling, and that might affect nutrients that could populate jellies. So as I said, it's a hypothesis. and it's a very difficult thing to test because we can't manipulate it experimentally. But yeah, there's definitely something going on there, and I think that a lot of the issues we have around population blooms are actually a consequence of some of this natural cycling. But then, of course, we do have anthropogenic impacts that in certain areas and for certain species might actually exacerbate populations.
Wow, that's absolutely amazing. That blows my mind. That's amazing to think that you can have these huge cycles happening at like a global scale that are influencing something that, you know, is seemingly so small in the ocean as jellies. Wow.
Exactly. Yeah, no, when we first saw this pattern emerging, we were absolutely astounded. And it was such a clear pattern. So there's a lot more to learn there, I think.
Wow. Your research, you go out catching jellies. Some of your work has been on the Southern Surveyor, which is, for people who don't know, marine research facility, basically a floating lab. What's it like chasing these jellies out at sea in a big floating lab?
Oh, it's some of the most fun I've ever had, actually. I've done 2 trips, ocean-going voyages, and they have just been an awful lot of fun. You're at sea and you're, I guess, confined on a vessel with a whole group of like-minded people who are super enthusiastic about the science that they're doing. And, I mean, you're offshore, so you're away from the land. It can be really rough, which I actually find exciting. I love seeing the ocean when it's rough and bouncing around. But you're also collecting animals that you don't normally get to see because these are animals that are far offshore. So, every time you pull up the trawl net, you're like, well, what am I going to see today? What's going to be in it? Is it going to be something that is rare, something unusual? You just see a whole lot of organisms that you just have never seen before, and it's just really cool to bring those on board.
That's amazing. So you catch them with trawl nets?
Yeah, so we use plankton tow nets. So a plankton net has quite a fine mesh size to it. So the mesh size it varies, but usually around about 500 microns, so about 0.5 millimetre or so. And you just deploy that behind the ship, you tow it for a few minutes, and whatever jellies and other plankton, so things like crustaceans or copepods and all of those organisms get stuck in the net. You pull that aboard and you can have a look at what's in the back of the net. You can see what's there and how their location and distribution might match in with oceanographic features. So it's a lot of fun.
Nice. The biggest jelly in the world is about the size of a whale. Is that right?
That might be a little optimistic.
Yeah.
It depends what you call a jelly. So there are, if you're talking about some of the siphonophores, then yes, they can be tens of metres long. They're actually a colony of animals as opposed to an individual animal. But yeah, some of those colonies can be huge. If you're talking about your more typical jellyfish, then the biggest they get is about 2 metres diameter, which is still a pretty impressive animal.
Yeah, that's huge. What's the biggest one you've caught offshore in Australia?
This one I've caught is probably only about 0.5 metre. So a relative baby, but they're still pretty impressive. So.
Do you find certain jellyfish in certain parts of the coastline, or are they're pretty uniformly spread out? And I know your work's taken you across much of Australia's coastline. Is there distinctive populations of jellies in particular places?
Yeah, so just like on land, you've got different habitats. So the ocean has different habitats as well. So along our coastlines, we've got embayments, we've got coastal lagoons, and you've got the true coastal waters just off the coastline, and then you've got the deeper waters as you move offshore, and different species tend to occupy different habitats. So a lot of the species I've worked on have been the estuarine species, and as you move offshore, you tend to get quite a different type of jellyfish fauna. So a lot more of the small, what we call the hydrozyme medusae. These are really tiny, little delicate ones. You tend to get a lot more salps as you move offshore as well. So yeah, definitely you do find that the populations are quite well structured. And even for an individual species, there's been some work done on the genetics of Catastylus, which is the blue blubber. We call it the blue blubber in Queensland, but often in New South Wales and Victoria, it's brown or white.
Oh wow, it's the same. That's the same jelly.
Well, Yeah, sort of. So the genetics actually suggest that there's some substructure to the population there. But the colour is interesting because even though I would say that more of them are brown and white down in Victoria, at a given location you can actually find brown and white and blue variants of the jelly.
Nice.
So I've actually got a PhD student working on colour variation at the moment and trying to work out what the different pigments are, when they're under what conditions those pigments are expressed and developed within the animal, and what the role of those pigments are. So I suspect that some of the pigments might actually have a photoprotective function because, jellyfish might get sunburnt when they're in really clear water. And so having pigments that protect them from the sunlight might be really important. So, we're trying to work out why it is that blue jellyfish are blue in some places and brown or white in other places.
Nice. You mentioned that some of your research has focused more inshore and in estuaries. I noticed in reading some of your papers that you've been looking at ocean sprawl and the sprawl of or increase of structures that we build out into our marine spaces, and that this may actually influence the jellyfish habitat for those inshore jellyfish types and influence their blooms. Can you explain that a little bit more?
Yeah, so I guess to understand that concept, you've got to know a little bit about the jellyfish life cycle. So the stage that we recognise as being a jellyfish is really just one part of a fairly complex life cycle. So the jellyfish, or what we call the medusa, is actually the sexually reproductive stage. So quite often with jellyfish you have separate male and female medusae. They produce eggs and sperm, and when fertilised, those eggs develop into larvae. And those larvae then will swim down to the sea floor and they'll attach to usually some sort of hard substructure or substratum. So it might be, a natural substratum might be something like a rock, but a lot of what we put in the ocean is hard substructure that are unnatural. So things like jetty pilings, wharves, potentially aquaculture infrastructure and that side of things. So when the larva settles, it metamorphoses or it changes its form and becomes a tiny little polyp, and that polyp is attached to the hard substratum. And that polyp's only a couple of millimetres high, and so for most species we actually don't know where the polyps are located. So those polyps, as they develop, they'll actually start to grow little baby jellyfish, if you like, on the top of the polyp. Sometimes you'll have stacks of up to about 60 jellyfish developing on top of each polyp, and then those baby jellyfish will break free and swim away. And so the idea is that as we're putting more and more artificial infrastructure into our oceans, we might actually be providing more and more habitat for these polyps. And so that could potentially contribute to the increase in some species. But the caveat is that, we still don't know where the polyps are for most species. We know that for the moon jellyfish, which is one of the problematic species, it's highly invasive and has caused problems in many parts of the world, we do often find the polyps of that species on artificial infrastructure. But for the vast majority of species, we have no idea where the polyps occur. So, there's a lot more work to be done there.
So that's not necessarily, those structures won't necessarily be linked with jellyfish that we consider negative. It could be, just jellyfish that are in the population. So for some places it might be linked to, ones we don't want, like the moon jellies, but in other places, not necessarily.
Yeah, that's the case. So we really, certainly I think there is a link to some problematic species and hard infrastructure, but we still, it's still very difficult to actually quantify the contribution of artificial structures. So, to do that, we'd have to really know that the availability of natural habitat is limiting for the animal. And it's the increase in artificial structures that's providing the extra habitat. If the natural habitat's not limiting, then they may not have a significant effect. And even though we do see lots of hard infrastructure being deployed in the oceans, when you actually quantify how much is there relative to natural substrata, it's still very small. So is that relatively small increase in hard substrata really driving massive increases in jellyfish populations? We don't know. It's a theory.
Yeah. There's so much that we don't know about jellyfish, really. I noticed that some of your earliest research was actually looking at jellyfish from the perspective of them being harvested for food. And probably a lot of people aren't aware that there is a market for jellyfish for consumption for people to eat. So your early research looked at these harvestable jellyfish. For other sea products like seaweeds, we're seeing markets change and emerge, and there being a greater demand for those products. Is demand changing for jellies? Is there a point where Australia could produce or harvest jellies for food?
Yeah, potentially there is. So jellyfish is eaten quite commonly in Asian cuisine, and it's been harvested for thousands of years in Asia. So the commercial harvest is around 500,000 tonnes per year globally. So it's actually a reasonably substantial fishery. And there are some parts of China where they've actually over-harvested the species to the point that they're actually restocking some of the local embayments with baby jellyfish that then grow up and that the fishes then get to harvest when they're adults. So you can actually overfish a jellyfish population. So people are starting to look at aquaculture of jellyfish now as a replacement for harvesting the natural stocks. So in Australia, the blue blubber, Catastylus, was a species that was considered to have sort of the right texture and taste and everything else to make it suitable to be one of these harvested species. And so my PhD was really looking at trying to uncover the biology and the ecology of the Catastylus so that we could develop some sustainable management policies for this emerging jellyfish fishery. Now, in reality, the jellyfish fishery didn't really take off in Australia. And there were a few reasons for that. Probably the main one is that it's a fairly low-value product. So you have to catch a lot of it to actually make some decent money if you're fishing for it. And usually the commercial fishers who held licenses had multi-species licenses. And there was usually another much more valuable product around at the time. So, why would you catch jellyfish if you can catch prawns, for example?
Yeah.
So there wasn't a lot of incentive for the commercial fishers to go out and get it. And, of course, they do sting and they're slimy and, they're just a mess to handle. They also have to be processed quite quickly, and they're processed by drying, and that takes up like a lot of area, and they have to be processed with salt, and the salt can cause problems for concrete structures in some of the processing facilities. Yeah. So there were just a whole lot of little things that, when you put it all together, added up to making the fishery in Australia not really viable. So it hasn't taken off. But it's not to say that, as the human population increases, the demand won't also increase for jellyfish.
Yeah. But what you're saying from other places is if it does, you still have to manage those jellyfish populations and be really, really careful about how much you were to take from the system.
Yeah, that's right. And that really speaks to the fact that that jellyfish populations aren't necessarily always like rats, We can overfish them. And that's a big surprise to a lot of people. And the fact that people are out there restocking the natural environment with jellyfish is quite astounding to a lot of people. So.
Yeah. I have to ask, did you try jellyfish?
Yeah. No, I've eaten it on quite a few occasions.
Yeah. What does it taste like? I've never tried it.
It's like whatever sauce you put on it.
Oh, yeah.
So when you prepare it, so when you get it in a packet, and you can buy it at a lot of Asian supermarkets in Australia, so if you're interested, you can go and do this. So it comes dried, so it's a little bit like flat, salty pancakes. So you pull it out of your packet, and you have to run it under fresh water for quite a while to get rid of all the salt. You then shred it into little strips, and so it's like eating noodles. You then blanch them for about 5 seconds in boiling water, and they sort of shrivel up a bit. And then you mix it with sauces like sesame oil and soy sauce, and you often add other seafood into it, so prawns, or you might add some chicken into it. And just serve it as a cold salad.
Nice.
So it's a little bit like eating glass noodles.
Yeah.
And, the flavour is whatever sauce you stick on it. So it's actually quite nice. So, if you're out at an Asian restaurant and see it on the menu, it's definitely worth a try.
Nice. Kylie, you've spent your life studying marine ecosystems, often from the perspective of the life cycle of jellyfish. But that's taken you across Australia's coastlines everywhere around the country. That's quite an achievement, but it's also given you an incredible insight into how our marine ecosystems function. What do you think the future holds for Australia's marine spaces?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's very easy to go down the path of saying it's all doom and gloom and, the world's going crazy at the moment and being negative. But I mean, Australia has some of the most pristine waters in the world. There are some places that are almost untouched. We don't see it when we live in places like the Gold Coast or Sydney or Melbourne necessarily, but so much of Australia's coastline is undeveloped. And you go to places in Western Australia, for example, there's barely anyone living there. There's very little nutrients running off into the ecosystems, and so they are in an amazingly pristine state. We do have some. Clearly we have some challenges with ocean warming and acidification, and that's a global issue. It's something that's tricky to manage at a local level. But in terms of what the future holds, our ecosystems are going to change without a doubt, and it's how we manage that change. And change is, we don't want to be losing a lot of species diversity, but our ecosystems will still be there. They'll just be in a slightly different state. And what we really need to do, I think, as people who research this area, is try to understand how the ecosystems are going to function. How do we maintain the major ecological functions of our ocean ecosystems through this sort of disruptive period of anthropogenic change?
Do you think that's one of the successes we've had here in Australia, is that we have so much untouched blue space from that local input scale, even though it is being challenged by global pressures?
Yeah, I think say it's a success, it sort of implies that it was deliberate on our part. Whereas I think it's just the fact that we have a huge country, our population is still relatively small, and there's a lot of our country that is not easy to inhabit. So a lot of the Western Australian coastline, for example, is really arid. So it's not going to be able to support huge concentrations of agriculture and people. And I guess it's a consequence of that. I'd like to say it was all by design, actually to a certain extent by luck. But knowing what we know now, we need to make sure that we do protect those areas into the future.
Yeah. So you think we can turn that luck into design for the future?
I hope so. I don't think it's too late to change the trajectories that we're on. And maybe this period we've had with COVID and disruption to our lifestyle and the reductions that we're seeing in carbon emissions, maybe that's enough for people to start to really reevaluate what we're doing to our planet, and perhaps put a little bit more motivation behind trying to adjust our behaviour so that we have we limit our footprint on the landscape.
Nice. You run Jellypedia online, which is where people can get all their jelly questions answered. I noticed on there you've mentioned there's been 2 Nobel Prizes awarded based on the research of jellyfish. One was into the research of green fluorescent proteins, which is, you're talking about the colour of jellies and what they do. We can learn a lot of things, not just about jellies in the ocean, from sea jellies. What do you think is the most pressing research question, though, that needs to be answered about jellies now?
Ooh, that's a hard one. I think trying to understand these global scale patterns that we're seeing in their population dynamics. So what is driving these jellyfish cycles? Because certainly we see this happening on a global scale, but even on a local scale, we're seeing populations go up and down. Not necessarily on a 20-year cycle. That's kind of the average of what's happening globally. But in places like Moreton Bay here in southeast Queensland, we've got about a 15-year data set for jellies now, and we know that those jelly populations are cycling on about 5 or 6 year cycles as well. So trying to understand what's driving those is important just in terms of understanding their population dynamics, but also trying to predict how they're going to be interacting with humans. So as humans, as we become more concentrated along the ocean, we start using the ocean in different ways. With putting aquaculture facilities along the coast, interactions with jellyfish are going to increase just as a consequence of us moving into that ocean realm. So trying to understand what's driving these population dynamics of jellyfish, how jellyfish are going to interact with humans and how we best manage those interactions, I think is a really important thing that we need to be addressing.
That's a really interesting point, because particularly in Australia we have a lot of jellyfish that are quite dangerous, and venomation can be deadly. And you've actually done some research on these deadly jellyfish. How difficult is it to work on them?
Well, they are really tricky to work on, particularly things like irukandji, which are a type of box jellyfish. And They're often really sparsely distributed. They're tiny. They're about the size of your thumbnail, and they've got really potent venom. So working with them can be tricky. Just finding them can be really tricky. So we're about to start a project later this year, which I'm really excited about, and it's developing the use of eDNA as a tool to detect dangerous Mericantha jellyfish. And this is work we'll be doing off Ningaloo Reef, funded through the Ningaloo Foundation. And we will, so what eDNA is the E stands for environmental, so it's environmental DNA. So all animals or all organisms shed DNA into their environment. So, we're constantly shedding skin cells and hair cells, and we're leaving behind traces of DNA wherever we go. And jellies are no different. They're shedding mucus that's full of cells into the water column the entire time. So what we can do is use genetic approaches now to detect those jellyfish. All we need to do is to take some water samples, and we can test those water samples to see whether or not they have the DNA of particular types of jellyfish there. So we can determine whether or not these dangerous animals have been in an area just by sampling their DNA. We don't necessarily have to find the actual animal itself. And so developing this tool to use to detect the animals is going to really help us understand the ecology of them, but it's also got super important consequences for human health and understanding, how do we actually better minimise interactions between people and these dangerous animals, and of course for businesses as well who rely on being able to safely put tourists in the water. So, really excited about this project from all sorts of reasons.
Yeah, that's really interesting that you'd be potentially able to predict and tell people whether it's a safe time to swim in the water or not. That's really interesting because also, do we know if these particular deadly jellyfish have the potential to change their range or their time of year that they're in the water? Do we have an answer to that yet?
No, we don't have a definitive answer. So a lot of the cubozoans, in particular the really dangerous ones, are tropical species, and there is a lot of concern, and there's a lot of evidence actually that many tropical species are moving further south. So the East Australian current is accelerating as a consequence of climate change, and that's actually drawing tropical species further south along the east coast of Australia. It's possible that the Mericantha jellyfish are also moving south as a consequence of that. And we actually find Mericantha jellyfish very commonly around the Fraser Island region. And what we don't really know is whether or not the increase in the number of stings that we've been seeing over the last decade or so is whether that reflects the jellyfish moving south or whether it reflects that there are just more people in the water these days and therefore more likely to be stung. So we don't have any long-term data. And a lot of people sort of use sting data, where have people been stung to try and infer where the jellyfish are. But that's highly problematic because, I guess as I just said, it could be a consequence that there's just more people in the water and therefore you get more stings. But we usually don't know what animal is responsible for the sting. So if someone gets stung, they might have classic Mericantha syndrome, but because the animal is so small, you hardly ever see what has stung you. And there's actually a delay between being stung and when the symptoms first appear, the delay of up to half an hour sometimes.
Wow. So
you never get the animal that has stung the person. So trying to confirm that it's actually that particular species of jellyfish that's caused that outcome is really tricky. So what we're really hoping is that as we develop eDNA and as the technology becomes, more routine to use, it will be much easier for perhaps organisations like surf life-saving organisations just to have the machine that goes ping in their facility, and perhaps they can take daily water samples and just see whether there's anything nasty around. I mean, ultimately, that's where I'd love it to go. And I guess that might be 10, 20 years away. But the work that we're doing now, I guess, has that ultimate aim that we'll be able to really accurately detect whether or not they're there, and that people can start using it to get a better understanding as to what the risks are when they're entering water.
That's fantastic, because I think probably for a lot of people they wouldn't realise that there are so many applied outcomes to understanding jellyfish, things that impact human health, that impact how we use marine ecosystems, the food we get from them. Jellyfish have a role to play in so many different ways we interact with our blue spaces. That's incredibly interesting. last thing before we finish up, a professor of marine science, you're a world expert in marine ecosystems, you're doing all this amazingly applied research. Is this where you thought you'd be? Is this what you started out kind of with the goal? Did you always know marine science was for you?
I think I am one of the lucky people who I knew what I wanted to do from a young age. I grew up with parents that really instilled a sense of curiosity. I'd always be out fishing with my dad, and he'd cut open the guts of a fish to see what it had been eating, and I loved doing all of that sort of stuff. So I knew early on that I wanted to be a marine biologist. I guess I never imagined at all that I'd be studying jellyfish. It's not really what you think about when you think about what a marine biologist do. You kind of think it'll be whales or dolphins or sharks or something charismatic like that. But actually, the jellies have been a really amazing thing to see for my career, because when I first started, there was so little known about the ecology of these animals, and the amount of research that's being done now is incredible, and it's just growing exponentially, the number of papers that are being published each year. So it's been really exciting to be sort of at the start of that sort of upward trajectory of research in this group of animals. So yeah, I am where I'd like to be. So I guess I'm pretty lucky.
Nice. In terms of this huge trajectory of jellyfish research, where is that taking you? What's influencing you to keep going and ask those big questions about jellies?
Oh, well, even though we've learnt so much over the last 20 years, but we've barely scraped the surface. There are new species being discovered all of the time. We're only just starting to get a handle on their population dynamics. Every time, I think I understand what they're doing, I find out I'm wrong. It's like, yep, back to the drawing board. So I don't think I'll ever run out of interesting questions to ask about jellyfish. There's all sorts of, there's just the general science and the ecology that's interesting, but the implications for, I guess, human health, or this, the socioeconomic impacts of jellyfish, that's all pretty interesting. And those interactions between humans and jellyfish are only going to get more intense as the human population increases. So, there's an awful lot of work we can still do.
That's absolutely amazing. Thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today. Professor Kylie Pitt, thank you for all the work you've been doing.
Thanks, Tracy. It was great to talk to you.
Thank you for listening to the Deep Blue On My Doorstep podcast. Don't forget to check out our website at events.unsw.edu.au, where you'll find all the photographs from this podcast series featuring the beautiful places that we've been discussing and the organisms found in these blue spaces.